So maybe we can start with this apparent paradox, which is something I think about too, because within a single sentence, you both said you have an avatar of the player you want to be by your mid-50s, but also that I think you removed, what did you say? You removed goal orientation from your drumming or something like that.
Yeah, well, drumming for me is a creative pursuit first and foremost, and I always say that the only thing that I've got going for me as a player is that I care about the instrument, and so I care enough to sit down and work on it. So yeah, 27 years in, how do you sustain that? How do you actually sort of still care about what you're doing and care about the fact that your love for the craft? And I mean, this is a big conversation we're opening up already, but it's kind of like it's anecdotally just my personal journey and my wrestle with the whole thing. Because like I said, I'm not really into the talent conversation. I mean, my only talent is that I care about sitting down and working on the instrument. I identified that really early on. I have an obsession with it. So that really is the main thing for me to nurture, right? To my creativity. So if anything sort of gets in the way of that, which I identified pretty early on too, like covers bands and things like that, or teaching too much, I put the kibosh on it, so I pretty much shut it down straight away. And to the point where I'll go work in other industries at the risk of not being a professional, just so I can sustain my desire to sit down and do the reps, because that's all any of us have going for us. The desire to sit down, regardless of feelings, and do the reps to either become the player you want to be, or at least to get better so that you can become more marketable, as you said, or more viable as a player. So for me, and I think it's probably just due to my story of becoming a young parent and moving away from touring and moving into another industry to sort of generate an income, I still had all that obsessive drum energy. So I just put it into practice. And at the time, I wasn't really thinking about it. Steve Jobs famously says you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking back. And I love that saying because for me, it really highlights the idea of, blind faith or using intuition. And at the time when I pulled away from touring, I pulled away from some very big projects that were doing international stuff, but it just wasn't right for me. My intuition was telling me it's not the right thing to do. So I just focused on my situation, which was raising my family, and I had an espresso bar at the time, which was sort of paying the bills. And then I just practiced like a mofo. And that journey was really important because what I realized, and I started sharing that stuff online, I suppose just the ideas that I was coming across, some of my single kick stuff, some of my facility development, really just as a cathartic sort of journaling, I suppose, which is how a lot of us find our social media initially. And that's kind of how I still treat it to this day. It's just sort of sharing the journey. And then I just started to realize I was noticing a lot of players that I came up with that were now working full time, whether it be through teaching or covers or even in international acts touring. They just weren't getting any better. They were just, and not only that, but they were kind of losing interest actually. Whereas I sort of found this growth period a couple of times in my life due to circumstance later on as well. Like obviously I had that initial growth, but in my early 20s, I had another growth period because my son was like a year and a half, 2 years old then. And I didn't want to go touring. So I just put all that energy into practice. The same thing happened again in my late 20s when my daughter sort of came on the scene around then. And once again, I didn't want to be away. So I just focused on practicing and removing, and that just really really opened up that idea of just loving the process. I just love sitting down and getting better. My version of it. I'll always put that caveat in there, my version of it, because your playing's not for everyone, but it shouldn't be either. So all I have a plan on doing, and you could summarize the whole podcast in this in a nutshell, really, but all I have a plan on doing is just becoming the best player that I can be in the time that I've got and trying to keep myself physically and mentally as strong as possible to facilitate that, but not at the expense of my responsibilities. So I've got 3 kids now. My son that I mentioned, he's now 20. My daughter's 12, and I've got another 10-month-old, and they're still priority number 1. I usually come down here early hours of the morning, or once the kids are at school or daycare and things like that, and make sure my wife's all good. But I suppose what happens is that if you do focus on your playing and you do get better and you do find a niche, I suppose, or a voice, what can happen is opportunity starts to present itself. And so even throughout my time of those growth periods where I wasn't touring and whatnot, because I was still working on my playing and sharing it, I was still getting opportunities. I was still getting things come forward, maybe a fill in for an international act, or you know what I mean, like things like that. High caliber stuff still, but just bits and pieces here and there. And I was very selective on what I did, and I still am to this day. And so, yeah, that goal orientation is still key. Like, it's all about goals for me. I've got 5 or 6, as we all do at any given time, but I just don't think that the drums owe me anything. So anything that comes my way, I'm like, oh, that's great. But maybe that's not for me. And I do this quite often. I'll be like, probably not the best thing for me right now. I'll give it to this drummer, or I'll recommend this guy, and because it may not align with that vision.
In my own story, I don't know if my story is representative of the world at large, but I feel like when it was just pre-drum internet, so like late 2000s, early 2010s, before Instagram and YouTube were really a huge thing, I feel like there was a lot of gig comparison. And a lot of people were judging their success by how many gigs they had, how good the gigs were, whether they were playing at the top venues. And this is in New York as well, where it's like practically every ambitious musician in the world descending on this tiny space with just a few venues.
Sorry, and you've always been New York based?
Well, I grew up in Montana, but I moved to New York at like age 20 or 21. So I've been here since then. I'm 45 now. So yeah, my wife and I settled down quite a while ago. But I think around the time that music writ large was switching to the internet, I was also getting frustrated with the sort of scarcity mentality around that, sort of fighting over pennies, I guess I would say, in the New York gig scene. And I think the move online for me heralded like both opportunity, but also like a lot of humility, because all of a sudden I could no longer blame the scene or connections or anything else. It was just my playing and the microphone. And I realized, oh, I suck. And I think that lesson was kind of hard won, but I think maybe that's the thing in my head, analogous to the thing you're talking about with feeling like the drums don't owe you anything. It's like, here's this thing that we have the opportunity to master and to practice, but at no point are we entitled to any sort of opportunity out of it, right? If it springs out of it serendipitously, great, but otherwise the love of the craft kind of has to be enough, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, there's a few things in that as well. You said humility, and I always talk about, like, I suppose to like kind of rub off on that, I always talk about accountability. Man, at the end of the day, you're responsible for you. I'm responsible for me. Like, I will never moan about my circumstance, because my circumstance is mine and I generated most of it. You can't control the external stuff, but then you can take that stoic approach where you don't need to control that. You just need to control the stuff you can control, right? Excuse me. But removing expectation just puts you back in the driver's seat. I see too many people scrambling and complaining, and I teach a lot of intermediate to advanced students and even teachers, and they're all battling this idea of either just wanting to grow their career or trying to figure out why they can't be bothered practicing anymore, or their desire to play. And both those two things are really important to me, because it's all well and good for me to sit here and say, drumming doesn't owe me anything. It's all I want to do is get better. But if you do want to be a professional musician, then how does those two things work, right? And I am of the mindset that still, if you want to be a professional, the only thing you have going for you is your desire to play. So that should still be priority number one. Your desire to practice. Because look, I mean, if you can learn to love the practice pad as a drummer, you've taken your progress into your own hands. That's just without a doubt. Because no matter how awesome you are on this here, it's still a pain in the ass for everyone involved. Like, it doesn't matter, even after 27 years, no one really wants to sit there and listen to me practice for 3 hours, right? So I embraced the practice pad really early on. I embraced it as early as my late teens, and I'm so grateful for that, because I would say probably 60% of my development happened on the practice pad, and it gave me that. And I really love the meditative process of practice pads. I don't know about you, but I get overwhelmed a lot by the kit sometimes, and so just the mechanics and working through mechanics on pads is really enjoyable. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling on now, but the point is that it's all well and good to talk about doing it just for the love of it, but how do we make a business from it? Well, I always say that, and like I make money, I think it's from like 6 or 7 ways within drumming, but there is an 8th way, and that 8th way is supplementation. And if supplementation, so working in another field, will sustain your desire to sit down and do the work to increase your value, where maybe that like doing something in another field to generate income isn't needed anymore, then great. Like there's so much ego wrapped up in every facet of this that it just gets in the way of the basic premise that all you have going for you. Initially, you were gifted your interest in the instrument. Now, I can't say why that is. I can't. That's getting really deep. But you were gifted, and I was gifted the desire to play the drums. Right? That is the seed. That's the gift. That's it. Everything beyond that, like you may mechanically understand stuff faster than others, and people can call that talent or whatever. But I truly believe the only talent is the stay-in power. So that is the thing that we need to nurture. And the more you nurture that, the longer you can stay in the hours required to get better, and then you can pick and choose from that point onwards. That's all I care about.
Yeah,
I'd rather work in another industry, and I did. I mean, I ran espresso bars and roasteries and cafes I started when I had my son at 20. I removed myself from long-term professional work as a drummer, and I sold my coffee roastery. So this is an arc of like 15 to 17 years, still working in drumming and doing bits and pieces, but the majority of my time I was running my businesses in another industry. I mean, my Drumeo appearance was while I owned my coffee roastery. All these things happened alongside it. And that really gave me the mental clarity and space that I needed to put all that drum energy just into getting better,
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to dig into is you talked about trusting your intuition. And I feel like one of the paradoxes of music is it's one of these things that takes decades to really master. And in the process of mastering it, you're going to go through a lot of pain and a lot of doubt. So it's a little bit impervious to the sort of like 90-day planning window we might use for the rest of our lives. Like, hey, is this new hobby working for me? No, 90 days are done. Let's leave it by the side. Like, is this new business venture really carrying its weight after 90 days? Nope, leave it by the side of the road. But for music, we have to sustain ourselves through times when our intuition is telling us it doesn't feel good. So I'm wondering how you reconcile those things, both in your own life and maybe when you talk to your students.
Yeah, for sure. I love that word intuition. I'm doing a drum clinic tour at the moment, and I go through 7 songs from 7 artists I've worked with over 20 years, and every song represents a different lesson. And a constant theme, like connective tissue through the stories, is intuition. Because you could be looking at the Golden Goose, a 3-month tour of the US, supporting an artist and doing all the major TV shows. But in my case, I had a young family at home. Everything that I've worked towards is saying, go. But the intuition is saying, hang on, buddy, you got to pull it back here. And the intuition is, it's a muscle. I think of it as a muscle using intuition. It doesn't always get it right, but the more you use it, the better it gets. So I listen to my inner voice and my intuition all the time. And like I say, it doesn't always get it right. But as I live longer and I use it more, the percentages go up. And that's kind of like what you can hope for. A lot of it's removing your ego. Like I said, when I was about 23, I was playing with an artist named Kimbra, and she'd been signed to a major label, and we were part of her growth period, like forming her as a live band and whatnot. And then she did get offered, after doing a few weekends away and sort of building up the live performance, she got offered a 3-month tour supporting Foster the People in the US. And she got offered David Letterman, Jay Leno, and all the major shows. And I just couldn't do it, man, because my son was only I think he was only 3 or 4 then. And, he didn't come into this world for me to not be around, and it wasn't his choice to be here. And then my wife also at the time, I've been with her for 18 years now. So at the time we'd only been together for a few years, but, she didn't sign up for me to not be present. And these things it's all individual, right? Like what might be important to me is not important to someone else, or they can sort of rationalize it another way. That's not my business. But the intuition is just a muscle that needs to be constantly checked in on, listened to, and you got to beta test this stuff, man. Sometimes it doesn't land, and then you can learn from it too, which is great. It's all very cliche and trite stuff, but I said in my latest newsletter, like, cliche is a thing for a reason. It's overused because it generally means that it's worth using.
And in order to become world-class at anything, you have to have an obsession that probably borders on not completely healthy. This is another paradox that I've been struggling with for drums. And I think what I'm hearing is kind of the way you reconciled that was find a version of that obsession that allowed you to still be present in your family's life. Like you can be obsessed with drums in the practice room, and that's a way to channel that rather than having it take you away on tour.
Absolutely. And a great way to explain that is my obsession. I would just start it at 4 a.m. and I would do my obsession until 7:30 in the morning. So I would go down to my coffee roastery at 4 every morning and do my pad work until 7:30 on just practice pads because I was in a residential area still. And then I'd go home and I'd wake up my family and I'd take my daughter to school and I'd make sure everything's all good. And then I would go work for the day in my coffee roastery. And then maybe I'd hop on my kit for 30 minutes in the afternoon. But as soon as I got on the drums, I'm aware that my daughter's home from school now. My wife's at home. Dinner's going to be starting to happen. Like that part of the evening is quite a condensed time too. And so that's how I just created the time. I used to talk about this a lot more because people used to sort of bug out at my posts at 4 a.m. doing pad work. But I just I'm just of the opinion that you can make the time. Just find it in your day, and then people will say, "Oh, but what about going? At what time do you go to bed?" And I'm like, "Well, I go to bed when I'm tired, and then I get up early so I can like." You'll figure it out, Like anyone in high performance will just find the time, and you can do it not at the expense of other things in your life too. I think there's a healthy way to deal with this very unhealthy obsession, because that's what it is, man. It's totally an obsession. And I say this in the clinic as well. All I am ever, I'm just obsessed with it. So I've just got to figure out how to kind of filter this through my life and my responsibilities in a way where, people aren't getting caught in my backdraft,
You know who it reminds me of? Have you ever crossed paths with Richie Martinez from Arch Echo?
Do you know I have? I did a clinic with him in Spain. So we actually met there and he was fantastic. It was the first time that we'd met in person. We've talked about online and man, I had a really good hang with him, eh?
Yeah, he has the same backstory of having a young family and finding time to practice on the pad. And he credits that with helping him with his touch because he would have his daughter sleeping and he would be playing with one hand on the pad.
Brilliant. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I would say my most formative years with touch happened when my kids were really young because it was all pad related. And I created this routine. I'd put on a 3-hour podcast, put the metronome behind it, and I had a series of exercises that I did. And I did them like an absolute psycho. And I would say that was one of the biggest growth periods. I'm kind of heading back into a phase like that at the moment, which is super exciting.
I think this also hints at life circumstances as a forcing function to make practice more efficient. And you're kind of alluding to that earlier too, when you were talking about certain people you crossed paths with earlier and then seeing them 15, 20 years hence, and they're still in the same place because they've been touring and doing the same music, but they haven't been developing themselves. So do you believe there's a dichotomy between, let's just confine it to practice, but how big do you think the gradient is between like really high quality practice and bad quality practice? And if you believe that exists, like, what do you think the differences are? Or what are some differences that pop out?
Well, there's definitely efficient practice and non-efficient, but I don't think that any practice is bad practice. I seriously don't. Like, I remember this quote that was getting bandied around for years by Jojo Mayer that if it sounds good, you're not practicing. And I just think that's absolute bullshit. Seriously, because the thing is, and I say, and I back that up with this sentence here, I don't want to just be good at the things I do or great at the things I do or amazing at the things that I do. I want to be mindlessly awesome at them. So I go over things that I can do well, to the point where they don't just sound like I can do them well, until they sound like I'm asleep doing it because it's so effortless. And that's the obsession part, right? And I just will not buy into this thing that everything has to be a battle on the drums. This should not be the hardest thing we do in the day. It can be at times, but it should not be. And so the way that I work on things that I'm pretty good at all the time, because it's like, we always talk about guys like Weckel and Vinny and Gad and all of that. Tell me that they weren't obsessed and went over things that they can do pretty damn well for a really long time until they got to the level that we now see them as. This did not happen by like the idea of good practice and not good practice. touching the sticks on any level is great for the mind, the body, and the soul. You can feel bad about how well you got, how good the practice was, or how far you feel like you got through that day, but still, you've made progress in some shape or form. Now you can definitely have more efficient practice, like using a timer, being regimented, like being quite systematic, which I go through periods of doing both. So I'm quite happy to sit down I've got a 2-hour routine at the moment that I've just written recently that's broken into 4 30-minute windows, and they're very, very specific about what I'm hitting at each point. I've divided things up into minutes for the category, blah, blah, blah. But then I'm quite happy to sit down for 2 hours and just work on that flow as well, man, and just forget it all and just loosen the hell up as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the dichotomy between routine and looseness. And yeah, I feel that push-pull too. And one way I tend to think about it is like sometimes rigidity and routine and discipline is necessary to make us better, because our old habits have almost a gravitational pull to them. So it's almost like the band wants to play at 120 BPM and you want to play at 121 BPM. So after months, the distance is going to have diverged more. But in the first stages, if we're trying to just, if we're eking out little gains, our old habits are going to have such a gravitational pull that sometimes I feel like routines and strictures are like a scaffold you can grab onto, so that you have some kind of signpost for where you're going, instead of always reverting back to the old stuff. But as you say, like sometimes it's important to just seek the feeling of most comfort and most flow and live in that. And I too have been trying to figure out the balance there.
Yeah, that's really interesting too. We're essentially talking about creativity as well, in the sense that some of my biggest growth periods have happened from that rigidity, right? And then when you've earned, like time plus effort equals results. So when you spend 2 or 3 months on that thing you've been working on, then you get the fruits of expression, because now you've got a whole new bunch of tools in your arsenal. My biggest growths have happened from that rigidity, and then I get gifted the freedom of expression. Now, creativity for me is just 2 things, man. It's just a byproduct of 2 things: facility and inspiration. So if you're not feeling creative, one of these 2 forces aren't at play, or they're not in harmony. And most of the time it's the facility, because we tend to forget about how we got our skills in the first place. We forget that when we were in our teens, we used to spend hours and hours shedding and playing along to music and fighting for it every single day, because our simple monkey teenage brains, were just enthralled with it, and we had no responsibilities. And then we get into our 30s and we're like, oh man, I'm just not really feeling creative. And I say to my students, because this comes up all the time, I'm like, well, what are you working on? And they're like, oh, nothing really. And I'm like, well, you're not fighting for it anymore. You're not working on anything that's challenging. So your facilities, you've got a ceiling on your facility, so you can't express anything new. You're not working in any new areas that are uncomfortable, so you haven't opened up any new places. And then there's the inspiration side, and I mean inspiration off the kit. I mean listening to music, yes, but I also mean going for walks, eating good food, spending time with people that you walk away from feeling great. Inspiration versus facility equals creativity. So if you're lacking creativity, shake one of these 2 up, or both. And so I'm always working on both of these, both. Yeah. And then I don't feel like I'm having to find creative moments. Like I said to you, I've been playing 27 years, but my desire to sit down and play is stronger than it's ever been, which says a lot, because I've been obsessed this whole time.
One thing my students ask me a fair degree is it always going to feel like chasing an impossible goal, or like trying to summit a mountain where the summit keeps getting higher? And my personal answer is the worst period to be in is kind of the intermediate period, where you're self-critical enough to see the distance between you and your goals, but your facility hasn't reached a high enough level to satisfy you yet. But for me, I think there was a threshold where after I passed a pretty discrete point in my playing, the ratio of frustration to fun changed. And even though I still am acutely aware of the delta between where I am and where my heroes are, it feels good to play almost every day. I'm wondering if there was a similar moment for you, or if it's always felt good, or how was your progression on that?
I've always loved playing, so I've always loved sitting down and spending time on the kit, but I definitely noticed when I made a few jumps in my playing through those growth periods where that gap started to feel a little bit smaller. And I use that term loosely, man, because honestly, the bigger the rabbit hole gets, the more you realize you can't do. So don't worry, I'm well aware of what I can't do. But I do notice that those periods of sitting down and using and intuitively just spending time on stuff that you don't really know what the results are going to be or when the payoff's going to be. You've got to trust the process. Like I had this 3 to 4 month thing that I did for a very long, like every morning. It was like one part of it was 44 minutes, but it was 3 hours in total. I didn't really know where that was going. I just knew that a lot of the people that I liked their touch and feel would be dabbling in this stuff. And so I just sort of had to trust the process. And what I got out of that is, like you say, I got a little bit closer to what I saw myself as and saw my heroes as, which then it reinforces the whole thing and that perpetual motion starts. And now I've got those memory banks of growth through practice. I can easily write a practice session for me and know that, if I spend 2 to 3 months on this, it's going to be insane. And it's always, I say this a lot, but it's always what's funny is that the longer I play and the more I teach, the more I realize that it's the basics done at the slowest of tempos that make the most gains. So slow burn, long-term stuff. And, it's not the low-hanging fruit, or it's not the glossy version of drumming that we see a lot online. And I'm really hard and fast about how I approach teaching now. It's like, look, this is the stuff that over my 27 years I've isolated as high value ticket items. And I don't mean thin high value. I mean like thick, dense, long-term high value ticket items in playing. If you want to work with me, this is what we're going to work on. It's going to suck. It's dry. It's arduous. It's like, it's not going to get results without you logging time every single day, but I honestly don't care because I'm not looking for students. But if you're into what I'm doing on the kit, this is how I achieved it, and this is the only way I'm going to teach it. And there is actually a stepped process to that too. So guess what? This first part really sucks. You're probably going to hate drumming after it, but that's not on me. All I can do is just offer you the information and hope that you show up.
I like this sort of anti-marketing marketing. It's a little like the Marines, right? It's like
I really don't care, bro. Like I just don't, because I found that if I teach too much, I care less anyway. So I'm very selective on who I work with and how many students I take on. I only keep a couple of online lessons available on my calendar, like international lessons a week. My one-on-ones are like very few and far between now, because much like I've realized with covers bands, we've only given X amount of drum energy a week, man. That's it. So you can't compartmentalize your teaching from your practice in terms of the overall energy. You can teach inspiring students that don't tap into your practice energy. So for me, I only really deal with students that understand where I'm coming from, are keen to roll with me, and are generally intermediate to advanced, but probably more so advanced, because even I don't really have the patience for anything else, man. That sounds awful, eh? This is really anti-marketing, you're right.
Yeah, you're going to get so many students from this.
Oh, no.
I mean that like 85% sincerely. Well, I wonder if we can get a bit specific, and this is mostly my own interest masquerading as a podcast host. But so, yeah, I obviously did the video where I was looking into one of the sort of motifs that I identified that you like to use on the drums. I watched the Drumeo thing too, and I thought it was a really nice assemblage of some of these motifs. And I would almost say, like, I would almost offer you up as like the avatar for like what the way people want to sound, or the way they picture themselves sounding in that sort of modern drum like sort of fusion-y idiom. But say you had an intermediate to advanced player who had decent facility, pretty good timing, all the fundamentals you needed, but just wasn't
These are your stats, eh? A random person that I don't know.
Asking for a friend.
Yeah,
but
I love it.
But hadn't really explored much of the facility with improvisation and creating those motifs and chunking those shapes around the drums so that they could feel comfortable moving around the drums. I'm curious, what are to the degree you're willing to share, what are the sort of processes or what are some things that occur to you in terms of what you take that person through?
Yeah, awesome. Great question. It's a big question, and if I go too far back, it'll be like, well, when I was 4, man, just because you can zoom so far out from this stuff. So, intrinsically at my core, I always just say I'm a rock drummer. That's my bread and butter. So I come from a foundation of rock, and initially I used to think that was a bit of a crux. Especially when I started to explore, I suppose, the gospel scene in the mid 2000s, the noughties, and I started to think that my rock background was like a barrier of entry almost, or I saw it as like almost a problem in my upbringing as a player. But what I've realized going forward is actually one of my biggest assets is that I started off as a rock drummer, because rock drumming is just such a great place to begin with. And then from there, it can head into so many different worlds, right? Whereas I find a lot of other players in other genres tend to just stay in that genre. But I feel like rock drummers can actually, if they're interested in it, in my case I was, you can take an interest in jazz. Cool, now you've got a bit of that. You can take an interest in gospel. You can take an interest in reggae. And it all sort of comes from your version of it from a rock pillar. So first and foremost, that's what I think that I'm at in my core. And then I'm just really interested in color. So because I do have an interest in facility and stuff as a rock drummer, it means you've got to start to explore some other things. And I realized a few things in my late teens that have really worked for me. So one thing is that I look at drumming in very simple terms. So I should say I'm self-taught. So I haven't had lessons, and I don't, I've just sort of never been around the structured sort of normalcy of drum curriculum. So all the problems that I've solved have been through the pursuit of identifying things and figuring out ways that my mind can fix them, right? Or solve them. So one of the things I identified really early on is that drumming, in my opinion, is only one of 5 things. That's it. One of 5 things. Now, there is a 6th caveat that's more like a feeling, but still at its core, I think of drumming very, very much like it's one of 5 things. So it's either a single, a double, linear, non-linear, or there's a rest. So in my opinion, you can make up everything that we do on the drums with these 5 things, either independently or together. So like, if you've got a series of if you've got a large number grouping, it's either going to be a series of ones, or it's going to be a combination of ones and twos in any various order, or a series of twos. You know what I'm getting at. And then linear and non-linear and rest. Now the 6th one is dynamics. That's probably the thing that I'll sort of wrap around it as more of a feeling that we're adding to it. And that the way of viewing it like that just really opened up my approach. I've never really spent any time on rudiments, because I've just sort of saw it as it's just ones and twos. So where am I putting those ones and twos? And when it comes to being an intermediate to an advanced player and trying to open up your facility, I can only ever speak from my point of view. But the things that enticed me were, the things that I liked about players and that I identified as being like things that I didn't have that they had is, first and foremost, the transition between linear and non-linear, right? So are you hitting things together or are you not? And then the next thing would be odd number groupings. So I've done a lot of work on your 3s, your 5s, your 7s, and your 9s. And I could mean that exclusively for hands, or I could mean the combination of the hands and the feet. So it could be 5 is 3 on the hands, 2 on the feet. It could be 5 is in 5 on the hands. So there's like, even that starts to expand really quick. The next thing is anything I can do with my right hand, I can do with my left hand. So every sticking that I've written as a part of my curriculum that I wrote, that I teach, I can do it all with my left hand lead as well. And not so I can be a Simon Phillips or a Carter Beauford. That doesn't interest me. What interests me is, as a right hand dominant player, I can lead with my left hand just as confidently around the kit. And that was a game changer. Like being able to go left right on anything, or left right right, as opposed to sort of being bound by this dominant right thing, just opened up a whole world. And I'd say a lot of my weirder voicings are because of that, because I'm not bound by it being led by left or right. And my playing can come across a lot quite nonsensical as well because of that. It's kind of a little bit confusing almost. And I'm only saying that just because I get a lot of questions about what I'm doing. And often I don't really know. I'm just sort of like, I've done so much mechanical work and repetition work. And I always say this too, like, just cut me off if I'm rambling, man, but the reps are really where the value is. And you have to kind of get over where you're going to use it. Just forget about that. Compartmentalize the rep work. And so I've done a lot of rep work for hours, not really knowing where it's going to come out. But then I sit down on the kit and I write something for a band, or I'm just mucking around and it comes out. Because that's the beauty of mechanical work and getting used to things you're not used to, that they just come out in your playing, right? And then the last part of it is dynamic work. So I've done a lot of dynamic work. So I would say that odd number groupings, and then to add on that, the being able to switch between single and doubles on your foot within those odd number groupings fluently and effortlessly. So you can easily put a single or a double anywhere within what you're doing. And then dynamic work. Those two things, I reckon, are like massive game changers when it comes to facility exploration. The left-hand lead one is a 10x thing. Like if you've never really explored doing all your patterns and shapes left-hand lead, it will 10x your playing overnight. Once you've done the work, obviously, because it is a very awkward thing to start feeling initially. But I do believe that that's one of the easiest things that we can all add to our playing now, and start working on immediately, that could have probably the biggest impact. And then dynamic work as well. So intentional dynamics, intentional. Sitting there and doing the Molar thing where we've deconstructed all the possible strokes you can do on a drum kit and forgot about them as combinations. And now we're working on independent strokes with full intentional dynamic work. That was a game changer for me.
I think that's super deep. And yeah, I'm just making a mental note, like I need to go deeper into left-hand lead. There definitely was a period where I did everything left-hand lead. Like basically any rudiment, and or if I were doing like Alan Dawson rudimental ritual or those sort of things, I was just trying to practice them left-hand lead. And there's an overlap because it's funny. The video I featured you're playing in was one about being stymied with kit facility due to being too right-hand dominant. True. Well, thank you for doing that video, by the way. I appreciate it. It was nice. One of my friends sent it to me and he's like, oh man, I didn't expect to see you on here. And I'm like, oh shit, neither did I. That's cool. It's interesting how those serendipities can happen because I had seen one of your videos like last winter on YouTube and I was like, oh yeah, like he's very facile leading with the left, and then didn't think much of it. And then like a few months later, I saw the Istanbul video on Instagram and I'm like, oh, wait a minute. This is the same guy I saw. And I had already copped that right, left kick thing. And so I'm like, oh yeah, this guy rocks. The backstory knits it together to quite a degree. So another thing I'm interested in exploring is this idea about, spending a lot of time to practice something that you don't know exactly how it's going to redound musically yet, but you just kind of have faith about that. And it feels like from what you've been saying that a high percentage of what you practice is actually sort of in that category. So my question is, what is the process like for like, say you're going to go into one of these discipline caves where you're going to do a 3-hour scripted out discipline routine or whatever, time to the minute. Mm-hmm. Where do you get the inspiration or have the decision making about where you're going to allot that time?
Yep. So there'll be things that I'll always keep on in my practice. So dynamics and left-hand lead, I'll always work on that. And I really want to stress that I don't mean open-handed playing, because that doesn't interest me and it doesn't impress me either. When drummers switch, I'm like, that's really cool. I just want to make that more of a point for the listeners. I mean, like, like doing those combinations around the toms and everything with that full confidence of that left-hand lead. That will always be in my playing because I'm 40. I've been playing for 27 years as a right-handed dominant player, and I've also been right dominant for 40 years, right? So that's such a disadvantage for my weaker side. And as a side note, ways you can combat that. So I do things intentionally, like I open doors with my left hand, I brush my teeth with my left hand. Anything I can do psychologically to convince myself that I'm left-hand lead. But I will add this in. I'm definitely ambidextrous because I play pool left-handed. I use my knife and fork backwards. I do a bunch of things. I skate goofy. So I'm obviously kind of that way inclined anyway, which probably worked in my favor. But that's not to say that even if you're not that way, you can't still do the work. Those things will always be in my playing. So then what else am I working on, or what else will I do? I'll find the holes, man. Like if there's a part of my playing that I'm trying to execute or that I just can't do, then I have to just work on it, and I have to create a system and a process. I know it sounds like almost a bit of a basic answer, but it's like if I'm struggling with it, then I'll put the work in. The way that my process of just sort of trusting the process comes down to the data, because any time that I've done grind sessions for periods of time, I get rewarded for that. And the reward is that now I have that new thing in my arsenal or my tool belt. So that's kind of my process. And then it's just about being systematic. Now, the hardest thing, man, of all this is you actually doing the work. Like I said this in my clinic, drum curriculum's been pretty much the same for the last 100 years, yet people are lost as to what to practice. Some of our best players have already come and gone, man. Possibly some of our best players that we will ever have already come and gone. And people are still sitting there like, struggling to practice. And the information's out there, and it still just comes down to very basic stuff. What it comes down to is understanding that back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, drummers weren't even allowed to touch the drum set for the first 3 or 4 years. They were only on a practice pad. And until they had earned that right, can you imagine telling a student that came into your studio that, sorry, dude, for starting this journey, you will not be touching drums for at least 3 years?
So my first teacher told me, but I can't imagine telling that to any of my students now.
Not in this day and age, eh? There's no way when you've got Instagram and you've got YouTube and all of that. But, I mean, what do you get from that? You get pretty damn good hands, control and facility. So I am aware of that, and I'm aware of the history, and I'm aware of the past, and I'm also aware of the player that I see myself as, which, my future self I see as a world-class player, without a doubt. Like, I just know that unless I lose a limb, and even then I'll probably figure it out. But you know what I mean? Like, unless something gets in my way externally, the way that I'm not in a rush, man. Like, 15 years of more, to be 55 and sort of becoming the player that I see myself being. It'll probably happen sooner too, and then even when I get there, there's going to be a whole new set of goals and stuff. Because this is the beauty about goals, and there seems to be a dialogue online about goals that they can be like restrictive and like this in the personal development space. There's almost like this anti-goal spiel, and I always say to my students, I'm like, no, you set the goal, you put your mark in the sand. And you start moving towards it, right? Because it's the process and the path. And what happens is the potential of deviations. Your mind's working differently, your body's working differently. Something will stem from that, and now your goal can change. That's fine, but it wouldn't have happened in the first place had you not made a decision on it. So goals are, like, without a doubt, the best way to move forward. Just understand that there's a fluidness to that as well, so for me, it's just about that understanding that the reps will pay off because I've got the data to support that. And just showing up as much as I possibly can to do the work that's required for my body and my mind to give into the process, and then trying to keep myself inspired outside of drumming so that when it comes to expression and using it, or exploration, then I'm pulling from these other places. And so I take that stuff pretty seriously, man. Like, I exercise every day, I read every day, I write every day, I do these things that I know that as a simple uneducated person have really helped me move forward as a player and as a person. And like I say, it's all anecdotal, but the data that I'm getting back really supports it. So I do these things every day outside of drumming, and they really support my drumming.
Yeah. I think maybe the way that maps onto my approach would be the idea of like diversifying my identity. Because for me, paradoxically, obviously, like, I'm obsessed with the drums, but if the drums were the only way I measured my worth, or the only place I put my identity, then I would feel like if on any given day or any given week, like, I were struggling with the drums, then that's going to like bring the whole mood down. It's almost like I need to diversify the asset portfolio. So my family, other hobbies, other interests, good books, good film. It sounds like you skate. I do jujitsu. So just like other things we can place our interests to sort of balance things out and equal them out. And for me, at least, that helps get me through some of the frustrating periods too.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, this is always frustrating, right? Because it's never going to happen as fast as we want. So that's a given. Some weeks you feel better than others. Sometimes I feel like I'm going backwards, and I say to my wife, "Man, I really suck at this, eh?" And then her and my daughter, they crack up because sometimes I will come back from practice sessions just going, "Man," or I'll come back and I'll go, "You know what? I'm pretty damn happy with today. I feel like I'm getting somewhere now." And then she'll be like, "Oh, now do you? Do you feel like you're getting somewhere?" But I find that exercising and reading, I prioritize my health and then my well-being. Those two things combined really, really help me on the kit and off the kit as well. And so, you don't even need to be specifically focusing on like whether it's jits or skating. I do a lot of running, and I do a lot of rowing, and I do a lot of bodyweight stuff, just anything to sort of keep me physically because as I get older, things do get harder. I've noticed that, especially turning 40, man. I found a couple of new aches that I never had prior. And so I do a lot of maintenance outside of it. But the real benefit is the mental health stuff, man. Like I feel when I go for a run, I get the gift of feeling really, really good about myself because I did it, because most of the time I don't want to do it, but I still do it every single day. And then I also get the gift of dopamine. And that in turn gifts me ideas. And so I think a lot while I'm running, and I get gifted the idea. So I've, like my mastermind drummer concept. So where I sell my courses, and the whole idea of developing the person and the player, this whole thing came from me just in one run. But the idea of it was an extension of my teaching over the last few years. Because what I've noticed is that the more I share of my personality online, essentially a brand almost, it attracts a certain type of student or person. And then dealing with those students has sort of helped reinforce my ideas in terms of what I value as a person and a player and an educator. And then that in turn shaped into this holistic sort of way that I approach drumming now, where I really prioritize my health first, because the body is the filter to the mind. My mind, then I just am very, very careful as to what I let come in. And then in turn, I'm able to put out better things from my mind, more self-control, more discipline. Less rubbish, man. Like everyone on my social media is muted. I don't watch TV. I don't watch the news, just because it just doesn't serve me. Anything that can help reinforce my ideas of positivity and creativity and staying in the zone and that I'm in control and all those things, in turn help me over here. But that's a byproduct as well,
Yeah, a little bit of a curveball. I had a thought the other day, which is that, I think we both probably read a lot of online comments, or maybe you don't because you filter out stuff, but I definitely do. But the thing that occurred to me is like, it's very, very rare that a truly world-class musician is not humble. Like you'll see it. There are some world-class musicians with egos, but it's very, very exceedingly rare in my experience. Like when you're in the presence of people who are like, have really gifted to put in all that work, generally they're humble. Has that been your experience too? And like, what do you do to communicate that to your students? Or does that even come up?
The comments thing is interesting. I've definitely gone through my fair share just because of the growth on social media. With that growth became a higher percentage of opinions that I wasn't really signed up for. And I, not to deviate, but I do remember talking to my son in his teens when he was struggling with people. And I just said, look, man, he was struggling with a couple of people at school, which is pretty classic as a teenager. And I just said, man, do you like everyone that you come across and you meet? And he's like, nah. And I'm like, exactly. Like, they don't need to like you. And actually not everyone should. Like that's you're unique. Your approach to the world is unique. And so I kind of use that information back on myself. And I'm very comfortable with the fact that people like my playing and people don't like it. And it's really no bearing, but I've had to kind of get to that place when I went on Drumeo, I was exposed to their audience, not just my audience. I was in my safe little world up until that point where people signed up for me. Then I went to their audience and everyone let me know what they thought, good or bad, And I think that's a little bit of a disorder. I think that telling people what you think is a bit of a disorder unless it was asked for, and that's a whole different conversation. But at least being robust to know that people don't have to like what you do, and that's actually okay. I used to be a barista, and so trying to make the perfect coffee for everyone was just something that I could not do. So the day that I started focusing on the best way that I make coffee and finding the audience that worked with that, everything got so much easier, and the business got busier as well, ironically. And then, and what was the second part?
My rough heuristic that
The
a good way
thing.
to tell if a musician is legit is if they're humble. Like, it's very, very rare that really great musicians are not also humble to some degree.
Yeah, I'd say majority wise for sure. Now, anecdotally as well, I've definitely come across some pro musicians, world class musicians that don't agree with what I do, and they've made it very known. They've told me, and I've had run-ins with a couple, and I'm sure you probably know of them if you're in the scene. I mean, even all the way down here, rumors spread about people's personalities and stuff, but they don't need to be made a point of or put a spotlight on because that's not the majority. And what I've also realized is that, and this is an important takeaway, so I've got a personal philosophy that I really push. You're probably picking up on that, right? That's my philosophy. That's what I stand for. And if someone comes to me and they say, hey, I really don't like the way that you're pushing this or what you're doing or the message you're sharing, I'm like, great. You now know your personal philosophy. You're welcome. Like, that's actually a really good result because there's nothing worse than beige. Seriously, and I say this to my students and at my clinics and whatever, just have, you need to stand for something. You don't need to tell people what you think of their playing, but you need to stand for something. When you see something in someone's playing that you identify with, great, bring it in. If you don't identify with it, great. Put that in the category of, that doesn't work for me. I don't understand that, and I don't want to understand it. Refine your views on the world on and off the kit, but just don't be beige. So I would say you're right, as a percentage, most great players will be humble, but I also know some great players that are definitely not, and they leave a path of destruction behind them. But those guys also don't get a lot of gigs, man, because even at that level, people just don't want to put up with it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Well, we could do a whole other hour, but I want to respect your time. But before we go, where would you send people to check you out? Like, what do you got going on? What do you want to shout out?
Oh, cool. Thanks, man. So my primary social media is my Instagram account, and I kind of just think of that as a business card, essentially. I'm pretty honest and open on it. So within a few posts, you'll see what I'm about and what I do. Live studio courses that I sell, and just sharing my journey online. But then I've got a website called masterminddrummer.com. And the term mastermind is really just a reference back to Napoleon Hill's book, Think and Grow Rich. The term mastermind meaning that a group of unified people on a collective journey. So this is a mastermind. You and I are doing a little mastermind right now. My clinics are a mastermind. Anytime you sit with a single or an individual or more and talk about big ideas and trying to move forward, that's a mastermind. So Mastermind Drummer is basically that idea, and it's encouraging people that sort of buy into that as an idea, that we work through this stuff together. And then I've just got a bunch of courses on there that really focus in on what, like I said earlier, my high value ticket items. So I've got a course on double stroke because I think everyone's journey needs to start there. Before rudiments and everything, dial in your doubles properly. I've got a course on my single kick approach. So the way that I got my foot to where it is, my chops, or I like to say facility more, but chops just, it definitely is the sort of
That's
more
the
modern
keyword.
term. It is the key word, yeah. And just and I also run a 30-day program on there that I've done with drummers all around the world, where it actually has a personal development aspect to it as well. So every week we work through a piece of drumming curriculum, but it coincides with a piece of personal development. So health, well-being, family, relationships, business, and that's probably the most fulfilling thing that I do because it really is an extension of me.
Awesome. So Stan Bicknell on Instagram and then masterminddrummer.com.
Yeah, that's it, man. And Nate, thanks for reaching out, and also just thanks for this, your service essentially, like especially your consistency. It's not easy to generate. I don't want to use it like this term loose. I don't want to sort of frame it like this, but generate this much content in such a genuine way. And you do that, and I've been aware of you for a really long time and what you're doing, and obviously the drum community appreciates it too. Due to your numbers that you've got on YouTube, you're doing quite well, so that's great. But just your deep dives are really enjoyable. So thanks again.
Oh, I appreciate that. That means a lot. Well, great to finally meet you and hang. Yeah, super deep convo. I think people will love it. And yeah, keep in touch. Maybe we'll do a part 2 at some point.
Thanks, man.
All right, take care.